What is up, guys? Frankie Dingleberry here. So we are continuing the trend of testing out older and used PC hardware on my channel because that is what I find to be the most fascinating when it comes to videos for any sort of testing of hardware on YouTube. And so today we are going to be testing a CPU, and that CPU is going to be the Q6700, not the 6600, which is infamously pretty popular. But basically the big brother of that CPU, just one step up. The only difference is that instead of being clocked at 2.4 gigahertz, it is clocked to 2.66 gigahertz because it has a multiplier of 10 instead of 9. And of course, we are going to be overclocking that CPU to squeeze every last little bit of performance that we possibly can out of it. So like I said, it normally has a clock of 2.66 gigahertz, which has a frontside bus of 266 and a multiplier of 10. But I managed to raise it to 3.1 gigahertz for the purpose of this video. So I can boot at 3.3 gigahertz, but I blue screen quite often, and 3.2 I was able to get steady for about 45 minutes, but I eventually did blue screen, and it does kind of blue screen once in a while, although it is random when it does. I just didn't find it to be stable enough for the purposes of this video. So for today's video, we are doing 3.1 gigahertz. And so this CPU is actually locked, and the only way I was able to overclock it was by increasing the frontside bus speed to 310 megahertz. Now, when you increase the frontside bus, it actually does screw with RAM speed, and I do have pretty generic DDR3 1066, so that could possibly be why I wasn't able to get it stable past 3.1 just due to the RAM. But yeah, I ended up having to dial back the RAM to 1034 megahertz because once it went past the 1066 that its default speed was, yeah, it crashed all the time, so I'd always have to bring it back. So yeah, that's what we're setting with today. As for the history of the CPU, it is actually part of one of the first, or might be actually the first, I'm not quite sure, but it's one of the first mainstream quad-core CPUs that people were able to buy for desktops. So back in the day, it was quite a big deal, and even by today's standards, they are quite powerful, although unfortunately, ever since I guess I'd say 2014, they've been really falling behind when it comes to the more modern games. But the beauty of these CPUs is that you can find them for a good $10 on eBay, and the Socket 775 motherboards are also extremely available and also dirt cheap. So when it comes to performance per dollar, these CPUs do offer a really good value regardless of how they perform in today's modern games. So I guess that's all the information we need to cover beforehand, so here is the specs of the system that I'm going to be using. As of the rest of the specs, we are going to be using an Asus P5E3 Deluxe Wi-Fi version, which has a Wi-Fi card built in, and it is an X38 motherboard. I believe that's a chipset for LGA 775, and it does have the LGA 775 socket. So it is compatible with all the Q-series quad CPUs and the Core 2 Duos, and as well as the Pentium D, which I also have a Core 2 Duo E8600 and a Pentium D that I do plan on testing a little bit later on in the future. And this is actually being cooled with a Hyper 212, which I actually purchased recently just so I could have a backup for the purpose of doing these videos, and is being powered by an EVGA 500 watt 80 plus white, which was my old power supply, but I removed it and replaced it with a modular one in my current main system, so I was able to have a backup power supply as well. And the RAM, I'm going to be using 8 gigabytes of DDR3, which is just generic green sticks, and they're running at 1034. They're supposed to be 1066, but yeah, like I mentioned, the overclocker, it kind of fucked with it. And for the GPU, we are going to be using my amazing MSI Gaming X RX 480 8GB. And with all that said, the formula for this video is going to be a little bit different. I'm not just going to throw some benchmarks on there and play some of my music and just kind of let you see them as they go, because the results from these games are actually quite interesting, and I had to do a couple different tests with higher and lower resolutions. So I want to talk to you guys about those results right here in the video itself, rather than just kind of throwing them at your face. And unfortunately, using Radeon Relive with the CPU was such a pain in the ass. I could not get it to work. The footage ended up coming out to be like 3 to 4 FPS. It was actually pretty horrible. Shadowplay actually did very well on my old CPU, so that's actually something to note when comparing Relive to Shadowplay, because apparently Relive just does not want to work. And if that's something on my end, I'm not quite sure, and if it works for you, then let me know in the comments down below. But for me, it just would not work. And I'm currently running the new 17.11.4 driver. I believe that's what it is. It's the one that just came out a few days ago anyways. But yeah, first we're going to jump into Cinebench. So Cinebench, the stock clock gave me 239 multi-core score and a 68 single-core score, but when I overclocked it to 3.1 GHz, I got an OpenGL score of 47 FPS, and with regards to the GPU that I have, I usually get about 110, so that's very low. And the multi-core score is 305 and the single-core score is 81, and that actually creeps like oddly close to the FX series of CPUs when it comes to the single-core score, because my 6300 used to get me between a 90 and 100 depending on the clock, so that's kind of interesting right there. Now we're going to jump into Firestrike. So with Firestrike, I got an overall score of 8,507. The graphics score was 14,426, which is usually about what I get with my 480. So in Firestrike, it goes to show that the CPU isn't bottlenecking this graphics test. The physics score was 4,961, and the combined score was 2,831. And now we're going to jump into pass mark. So the CPU mark score I got was 3,829, and the 3D mark score I got was 6,047. That's interesting because my 480 usually gets about 9,100, so it's showing that the CPU is definitely bottlenecking the GPU by a good 35% or so. But yeah, and also I ended up blue screening right after this test. I have no idea why. It wasn't actually a hardware failure, but I blue screened and crashed. But yeah, those are the scores for pass mark. So now we are going to jump into the games, and first we are going to jump into Call of Duty World War II, and we are going to be testing it out at 1080p Ultra, so everything just completely cranked to the max. So for an average, we got 30, 1% we got 19, and the 0.1% lows we got 17. And it may look smoother in the gameplay I'm showing you, but it was just horrible. It added a shit ton of input lag, and it really felt so choppy, like there was like 30 milliseconds between one frame and then 90 milliseconds between the other. It was just definitely unplayable. And then we turned down to 720p at its lowest settings, and we got an average of 35, a 1% low of 22, and a 0.1% low of 18. And so as you can see, it didn't really make much of a difference, which is showing that we are having a CPU bottleneck, because regardless of the slightly higher frame rate, it still felt disgusting to play, extremely jittery and just unplayable, so I do not recommend playing this game on this CPU. And next up is Rise of the Tomb Raider. So this game ran surprisingly well during the benchmark anyways, and we did it at 1080p in its Ultra preset, and so we got an average of 47.7, but during the last part of the benchmark, the part with all the foliage and stuff, it was horrible. I think it was only like 15, 16 FPS average, and it's just extremely jittery, so that part alone is just kind of what killed the benchmark. But once we went down to just the medium preset, so we didn't lower the resolution, we're still at 1080p, the average went up to 53, but then that scene with all the foliage, that average went up to 41, so it became very playable, and if you don't mind playing 30 FPS, you can play this game at its full resolution, which is awesome. And the next game we have is Fallout 4 1080p Ultra High preset. So the average was 31, the 1% was 23, and the 0.1% was 19. This game felt relatively okay to play. I think it resembles the console pretty well because it does often drop to like 20-25 FPS on console, but I really wouldn't recommend it since it is an FPS and it does feel better to be playing at 60 FPS. So we eventually did turn down to 720p at the lowest preset, and we only got an average of 39, 1% of 25, and the 0.1% of 21. So there's barely even an 1 FPS increase, which goes to show that once again there is a CPU bottleneck. So as you can see with these modern games, it's really not a good CPU to be playing those, which is kind of like what I mentioned earlier. But this CPU can handle games not too far off from its era. So we did end up playing CSGO 1080p lowest settings, and it gave us an average of 71, 1% low of 41, and a 0.1% low of 26. And this number actually surprised me. I did expect it to go higher than that, but apparently CSGO is quite CPU intensive. I don't play it competitively, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people like to have above the 100 FPS mark, so whether or not that's playable to you, you can decide from this video if that's okay or not. And next we got Black Ops 2 1080p Ultra. So this runs perfectly fine with an average of 148, 1% of 104, and a 0.1% low of 97. So this game runs flawless. There isn't any jitters, any stutters, so that's really awesome. If you enjoy playing Black Ops 2 Zombies or multiplayer, you can get by just fine with this CPU. And finally, we have good old Skyrim. 1080p at its Ultra preset. It does maintain its VSync of 60 FPS quite well. We do get an average of 58, a 1% of 38, and a 0.1% of 25. Those 1% and 0.1% do seem kind of daunting, but they were more like random stutters that happen during scenes with flames and stuff like that. So you're pretty much going to be at your 60 FPS most of the time, and this is of course ultra high, so it's probably the draw distance that's kind of fucking with it. So you can turn 1 or 2 settings down and you'd be golden. this CPU can play this game just fine. So yeah, as you can see, this CPU generally struggles with very modern games, which is kind of disappointing to see because the CPU has been pretty infamous amongst the PC gaming community for pretty much since its release. But I think now the good CPUs that people are going to be aiming for that are in that low price bracket are going to be like the 2500K and possibly even the FX CPUs, because we're just kind of in an era now where those quad cores are just going to become obsolete. So if you have one, I recommend upgrading soon. And but if you just want to buy one for like a simple HTPC or to play older games, then it's at least good for that. So yeah, I was kind of disappointed by those gaming numbers, but I mean, what you're going to do? It's 2017, so unfortunately games are becoming really multi-threaded, which is something that people have been saying for a long time, and it's finally that day is upon us. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more content. And if you have any suggestions about what you want to see me cover in the future, please leave a comment down below. And let me know if you're excited for the E8600 test I'll have coming up, which is a dual core but has stronger single core performance. So who knows, maybe we'll see better gaming performance out of that CPU over this one, because we do know games like clock speeds and cores. And then I also have a Pentium D, which is a whole different mess, and that probably won't even run Skyrim, but we will see. So yeah, till next time, peace trout, YouTube.